This is The Toss-Up, where an expert line panel dissects the hottest stories within the world of sports. From some of the nation's strongest college programs right here in Bloomington to the games and moments that captured the world's attention, it's all right here on The Toss-Up. The college basketball season is just around the corner, and for IU men's and women's basketball, expectations are high. Entering her 7th season at the helm of the women's basketball program, Terry Morin has brought this Hoosier team to a whole new level. This is a team that finished among the tops in the conference last year and may be even better this time around. And on the men's side, it looked like Archie Miller was finally going to get his first Indiana March Madness berth when the league shut down in March. So can the fourth-year head coach establish his Hoosiers as contenders in the Big Ten Conference? We've got Allie Patberg and Jalen Penn, Trace Jackson-Davis, and Rob Finnessy, and these are just a few of the names to look out for this season, once Indiana basketball finally tips off. In the meantime, we're going to break it all down here on The Toss-Up. So hello, everybody, and welcome to the show. I'm your host, Drew Frey, and joining me today, I have Will Trubshaw, IUS-TV women's basketball reporter, and Grace Ybarra, IDS men's basketball reporter. Welcome to the show, and we're just ready to break down some of the best of IU basketball. And so, Will, I want to start with you and discuss the women's team, who potentially have some of the most hype going into their preseason than they've ever had before. Where do the Indiana Hoosiers women's basketball team line up in the Big Ten Conference?
Well, I mean, like you said, this has kind of been a historic offseason for them. This is the highest they've ever been ranked in a preseason poll at number 16. I mean, it's a really talented team. You've got 3 guards on the award watch list, namely Allie Patberg, who's on Lieberman Award, Naismith Award. I mean, she's kind of in line for just about everything right now. And the team has been picked by the coaches and the players polls, coaches and media poll for the Big Ten to win it all. And I don't think that's unrealistic at all. I really think this is probably the best team in the Big Ten right now. You could argue that Maryland and Northwestern are right up there. Those 2 teams, of course, pretty much ran the table last year, including Maryland, who won at least a share of the regular season title, and then they won the Big Ten tournament right before everything shut down. But this year, I mean, you just look at the depth that the women's team has for IU right now. You return 4 of your 5 starters. You get a couple of good freshmen in. You get George Mason's all-time leading scorer to transfer over. I mean, it is a really, really talented bunch that Terry Morin has assembled this year.
Yeah, I mean, the Hoosiers were competitive last season for that Big Ten title and really only have room to grow, it seems like. So a lot of potential this year. And Grace, the same question about the men's team. The Big Ten Conference is going to be stacked up top, and we know that. So where does IU fall into that mix?
Definitely. I think IU would fall around somewhere in the middle. It's really tough now looking at that preseason top 25 AP poll where there's 7 Big Ten teams in the top 25. So after finishing last season around the 10th spot in the Big Ten and finishing just under 500, I think the Hoosiers can find themselves around the middle of the pack. Obviously, they're losing Justin Smith, and then they're also losing Devontae Green and Deron Davis. So there's a lot of gaps to fill with that, but they do have a really strong freshman class coming in, so it's going to be really interesting to see how they step up. But I would say definitely somewhere in the middle of the Big Ten, not near the top. They have a lot of really, really good competition in the conference in Iowa and Wisconsin, so it'll be interesting to see how things shape up.
Yeah, and Grace, you talked about some of these top teams that are on the national level that are going to be able to perhaps dominate the Big Ten. So for Indiana, who may be middle of the pack Big Ten, where could the Indiana Hoosiers fall in this national landscape? As we mentioned, Archie Miller potentially had his first NCAA tournament berth last year, obviously going to try and go for it again. How close are they, and where do you think the Hoosiers could line up?
I think they're very close to getting that first berth this year. Obviously not in the top 25 right now, but I don't think them entering the top 25 throughout the season is unrealistic. Definitely have to see how these new guys come together and play together and mesh. But just moving forward with this season, I think that they have a really good group of guys. And Archie talked a lot about during media day wanting to play more small ball, which is really different than what he's done in the past. So running the court a lot quicker and then kind of stretching it out to the perimeter with shooting a bit. So seeing how that transfers to games, from practices to games, and seeing how that shapes up against the conference and then also, like you said, the rest of the nation. But I think that could land them finally in the tournament this year.
Yeah, they were so close last year and so close the year before even, so this year could be the year for them. And Will, the same question to you regarding the women's basketball team. We talked about how they could be at the tops of the Big Ten Conference. Where does this women's team stand on a national level?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, if you go just by the preseason polls, the only team ahead of them in the Big Ten is Maryland. Maryland coming in at number 12 in the AP poll for the preseason. But, you know, it's just the preseason. I think Terry Moran would tell you that talk is kind of cheap. They have to go out there and prove it. But I do think they feel very confident. I mean, you look back to last season, they handed South Carolina their only loss of the season. South Carolina finished the season as the number one team in the country. Probably would have been a number one overall seed. So, I mean, this is a team that they have this experience playing ranked teams, playing good teams in conference and out of conference, and succeeding against them. So I think for the Hoosiers, they definitely, the number 16 ranking is well deserved. I wouldn't be terribly surprised if we see it climb up. You know, obviously now they're kind of the team that has the target on their back, so they're going to have to fend off a lot of challengers. There's a lot more opportunity for them to be upset rather than to do the upsetting this season. So that's something they got to watch out for. But I think if they can take care of their business against most Big Ten teams and against the other ranked teams currently in Northwestern and Maryland, I think there's a good chance that they keep moving up in the polls.
Yeah, as you mentioned, plenty of room to climb, but also plenty of room to fall. And we saw that last year, beating South Carolina, but then collapsing late against Ohio State at home. So let's talk peaks and valleys. So for the women's basketball team at IU, what is this team's peak? You know, what would be considered a good season for them? And then to counter that, what would be a bad season? If all the wheels come off, where does this team fall?
Well, for this team, they're looking to make the tournament. So I think a good season for them constitutes making the NCAA tournament and making a fairly deep run in that tournament. You know, I think any team would be you're always disappointed if you're knocked out in the first round, in the round of 64. I'm thinking if this team can get a Sweet 16 berth, maybe an Elite 8 berth, that might be a little generous, but I'm sure that's what they have their eyes set on. You know, I'm sure most players would tell you they're looking for a national championship. How realistic is that? You know, when you have to contend with the Oregons and the UConns and the USCs of the world, it's a tough ceiling to break through. But I mean, this is a very talented team. They're probably going to be the Big Ten representative that'll go the farthest. So now a bad season. I think there's a couple of metrics you can look at that. I think obviously missing the tournament, that would be a nightmare scenario, especially when you consider you'll be losing Jalen Penn and Allie Padberg after the season because they're both seniors. You know, you want them to get a tournament berth, and you expect them to kind of carry you in the tournament. And I think anything less than a top 4 finish in the Big Ten. You know, again, the expectation's been set, and you expect them to play well against most of the Big Ten competition. Again, it's really a three-headed monster of IU, Maryland, and Northwestern. If you're faltering, if you're struggling in conference play against some of those other teams, that kind of signals a red flag to me too. But I don't anticipate that happening. But I think that would constitute a bad season for this team.
Yeah, this is a team that it's had plenty of time to gel, and it's a very experienced team. But at the same time, if you want to look through their tournament berths in the past, they're sort of accustomed to 9 seeds, 10 seeds. Mm-hmm. So this could be the year that they really establish themselves a 3-4 seed in the tournament and make that deep run.
Yeah, I mean, this certainly would have been a season, you know, we'll see how things play out, but if things were normal, probably a year that the Hoosiers finally get to host some NCAA tournament games at Assembly Hall.
Yeah, and speaking of Assembly Hall, it's a beautiful segue, Will, thank you. The men's team was dominant at Assembly Hall through most of their games, but when they went on the road, it seemed like they were just a completely different team, and they fell apart. So a similar question, if everything is finally able to click for Archie Miller's squad, where can the Hoosiers go? And if he then has another letdown of a season, if these road games start to bleed into the home games and things fall apart, how low can this program sink?
Yeah, so I'm thinking a good season, like we already talked about, Archie hasn't seen the NCAA tournament yet. So a good season just to start off with would be making that. Obviously, they were on target to make it this past year, but the coronavirus pandemic canceled the entire tournament, so they didn't get to finally have that berth. So I would say just that first metric of having a good season is making the NCAA tournament. Now, on top of that, I think, like we already talked about, the Big Ten Conference is really difficult this year. So finishing above 500, I would say, in the Big Ten would be a really great metric for a good season for the Hoosiers. Now, on the flip side of things, I think as low as they can get, obviously, I wouldn't say, I guess this would be the 5th year that they wouldn't make the tournament if we're not counting this past year, but 4 years of not making it, that would be pretty low. And then if they finish under 500 just on the season, not just including conference games, I would say would be a pretty low spot. And then to finish worse in the Big Ten than they did this past year, which I believe they finished 10th in the Big Ten, I think is kind of how low that program can sink. So top would be making the tournament, bottom missing it again, even more bottom not making the NIT.
Yeah, it seems that threshold right now for Archie Miller's squad is that NCAA tournament, which has proved so elusive, and especially for the men's program, that hasn't really been the issue in the past. So it's especially unique of a circumstance now. And so, Grace, for everything to click, and for the Hoosiers to really find their stride, like they've shown they can do, just not consistently, what needs to happen within that program? What needs to be that key piece, that key factor for the Hoosiers to finally find the season they've been looking for?
A really huge factor, I think, this season is they just can't turn the ball over. They averaged 12 turnovers last season a game, and you just can't have that if you're wanting to make the tournament this year. And additionally, with those turnovers, lessening them, I think that with Archie talking about how he wants to have maybe a 3-guard lineup, just shooting better from the perimeter, shooting better from 3, that way that the Hoosiers can kind of spread out the offense so that guards, so that bigs like Trace Jackson Davis can work in the paint and be more of a threat. They already have that threat on the inside, so if they can spread it out and be able to shoot consistently from behind the arc, then that will really help them and really help them avoid that worst case scenario. That, along with turnovers, is what I'd say.
Yeah, exactly. Turnover is always a huge issue. And will a similar mindset for the women's team, for everything to go right, for them to make that deep NCAA tournament run like they want to get to and very well could, what needs to go right for this program?
Well, I think a couple things. Obviously, you got to stay healthy, and I mean that in the sense of obviously COVID-19 and stuff, but also injuries. I mean, you look at Jalen Penn, one of the key pieces. She's coming off plantar fascia surgery this offseason. She's not at 100% yet. She's been working out with the team the last month as they've been in person. But that's something you really got to keep an eye on. And I mean, just last season too, you could kind of see players kind of getting worn down. The bumps and bruises were getting to them. So I think the key to any season is you got to stay healthy. I think the other thing too is they need to be consistent and they need to be able to finish out games consistently. Because you mentioned last year they blew a game to Ohio State, and there was a stretch once they got into Big Ten play. They just didn't seem like themselves. They pulled out a couple games. They kind of pulled the lost leads, but then they were able to come back and win those games. A couple they lost the lead for good and couldn't come back. But they've had trouble finishing games, and they've had trouble staying consistent, scoring offensively. I think that's the biggest thing they need to worry about is, especially in the tournament, you need to be able to finish games. You can't take your foot off the pedal. And then, like I said, they just need to do that. The best way to do that, consistent shooting. I think it sounds like that's something they've worked on in the off season, at least according to Terry Morin. But that would be my biggest concern if I were the Hoosiers is you got to be able to finish games because it bit them a few too many times last year, and it could get you in the tournament when it's single elimination. Yeah,
it very well can. And finish strong, I think that's a very good point of emphasis. And guess what? We're going to finish strong on the toss-up here tonight. I'm feeling it. I'm feeling good about it. But first, we have to take a little bit of a break. So coming up after the break, we have even more men's and women's IU basketball. Plus, it's time to talk March Madness, that glorious tournament. So make sure you stick with us. Welcome back to the toss-up. Now, we talked about it a bit before break, but the end-all, be-all, the ultimate goal for both of these teams is March Madness, the NCAA tournament. But obviously, a lot of different factors affecting it this year, and one of those factors is going to be the lack of fans, whether that be in the tournament or just even in the regular season. So, Grace, I want to start with you because I know this affects the men's team, exponentially. We've seen it in years past. The lack of fans in Assembly Hall or even on the road, how much do you think that's going to affect the Hoosiers? For better or for worse, even?
Yeah, I'm really interested to see. I'm not exactly sure how it's going to affect them yet, but just thinking back to past seasons, I'm just thinking back to games like Florida State last year where the fans really helped push that momentum and push the team to be better. So just kind of thinking about what it's going to be like next Wednesday in that empty Assembly Hall against Tennessee Tech. What is it going to look like? Are they going to be hyping themselves up, or is it just going to be dead? How will that affect energy? So I think that it will be a detriment to teams to not have the fans throughout the entire season because they do help push them to finish out games like Will talked about earlier. So in terms of home, I think that's really going to hurt them. I'm not as sure about away. Obviously, that's going to be a little bit more helpful if they don't have those away crowds, but just getting used to playing in an empty stadium has got to be weird. They haven't done it their entire careers, so just hearing, I guess, like the squeaking of their sneakers on the floor in this super hollow Assembly Hall that's supposed to have 17,000 people in it is going to be odd. So there's going to be that learning curve with it as well, but I think it won't hurt them as much as we think it will, but it won't help them like it has in the past.
Yeah, I mean, even just especially knowing the minuscule amount about Indiana high school basketball, I mean, you're 100% right. Anyone who's come out of the state of Indiana, and Archie Miller heavily recruits out of the state of Indiana, knows that roaring basketball experience. So playing without fans may be an absolutely unique experience for them. And Will, going on to the women's side of things, I know the women's basketball games don't draw as large of a crowd. It doesn't pack Assembly Hall, and it just doesn't have as much history as the men's team does. But at the same time, they feed off the energy of the crowd that's there. So how much do you think that's going to affect IU women's basketball? And do you think it's going to have a similar impact, conference-wide?
Well, I think to a degree it will. Like you said, the attendance isn't the same. It's not a full 18 to 20,000 crowd for the women's team. But the crowd that shows up, having covered the team the last 2 years, I mean, it's a very dedicated crowd. Like the people who show up, they're there all the time, and they know all the players' names. They know the roster up and down.
Oh yeah, they're into it.
Yeah,
100%.
That's the thing. So I think, and that doesn't go unnoticed by the players. I mean, they know these fans. They see these fans coming up to them after the games and stuff. So I'm sure that'll be weird. And that was a good point you made, Grace. Just like these players, a lot of them, the ones from Indiana, are used to massive crowds all the time. So I think that's got to be a massive readjustment in the head. I think that goes for any sport, though. Not having the fans, it's just kind of weird. It's not what you're used to. And for so many years now, you've gotten used to seeing fans and stuff in the stands. So I think it'll affect them a little bit. I'm sure that at the same time too, like a lot of programs we've seen, they do things on the scoreboard. They do like fan interaction things. They pump in crowd noise. I'm sure we'll get something like that, but it's not a substitute for the real fans. So will it affect them? Yeah, I think it'll affect most in the postseason. Like I mentioned, once you get to March Madness, had things been normal, and if they have postseason games at Assembly Hall, that's when you get a real crowd. I mean,
yeah.
When IU hosted the NIT championship game, that was almost a sellout. Like the fans come out for the postseason, so I think that would be interesting to see without fans. But I think.
So do you think that IU women's basketball will miss their fans more once it comes down to postseason play? Do you think it's going to be more of an impact in the postseason during the NCAA tournament or Big Ten tournament than it would be throughout a regular season game against North Florida, for example?
Well, see, I mean, I think in general terms, yes, but I think we don't even know like where the NCAA tournament's going to be played. It might be in a bubble setting this year, so the home court advantage is essentially wiped out completely for any team. It'd be a lot like the NBA bubble.
Right.
There was no home court advantage. Sure, they had the video board projections of the Miami Heat fans screaming from their homes, but it's not the same. So I'm sure. I think the players would miss it just from a we love our fans standpoint, but I don't. No one's going to have that advantage this season.
Yeah.
With rare exception.
Yeah, exactly. And Grace, I mean, that could even be amplified more on the men's side, where not only is IU very much feed off their home crowd, but March Madness, the NCAA men's tournament, is just iconic around the country and played all over the country, different locations. Now, most recently, as we've heard, there are discussions to play every one of the games in a sort of semi-bubble within the city of Indianapolis. So, I mean, that could even be fairly local for this sort of area. But how different is that tournament going to look? And do you think that's going to detract from the overall experience of, March Madness?
Well, so I'm from Indianapolis, so I've grown up with a ton of Final Fours just in my backyard all the time. So kind of the connotations I associate with Indianapolis and just the state of Indiana is basketball. So I don't know if it will detract. Obviously, it's really cool to have people playing around the country and then coming together in those Final Four teams in that last city. But I think that hosting it in Indianapolis will still have that same kind of feel, just because Indianapolis hosts the Final Four so frequently that just putting the entire tournament there wouldn't feel different. However, I'm not exactly sure what that's going to look like. In my head, I'm imagining a ton of basketball courts just across the field of Lucas Oil Stadium, using like Bankers Life Fieldhouse and stuff. And I don't know if they're planning on using some of the bigger high schools around Indianapolis, but I'm really intrigued to see what that will look like, because in terms of all of the cities they could have picked, Indianapolis, while it is a big city, is no Chicago or no New York. And we have a ton of hotels in Indy, but do we have enough space for all the media and all of the teams? I'm just really intrigued to see how this is going to shape out, because it is kind of my backyard. But I'm excited nonetheless.
Yeah, and that takes us into what I want to sort of wrap the show up, a couple more questions, but on more of a positive note, just thinking back, because I mean, right now we're talking about COVID and all of the detrimental effects that it could have on the season, but I want to flip this around. Grace, you've grown up with Final Fours in your backyard. What is your absolute favorite March Madness memory, something that you're just always going to hang on to from something that's maybe happened in Indianapolis, maybe happened in New Orleans or anywhere else in the country, just something that is always going to be in your mind is this is college basketball?
Definitely. So mine is an Indianapolis memory, but I went to elementary school on the campus of Butler. So when they were making their first really big run in the tournament, we were just kind of experiencing it all with them. And then my mom surprised me at the last minute with a ticket to go to that championship game against Duke. So I went with my dad. I was 10 years old, and I had like that little like a Butler like paw print sticker on my face. We spent the entire game watching it, and up on like I think the south side of Lucas Oil Stadium behind one of the basketball hoops, and it was an incredible game. I had never watched a basketball game in Lucas Oil Stadium before, because growing up going to Colts games, but just phenomenal game. The energy there, having that home court advantage for Butler was incredible. But yeah, I'm never gonna forget Gordon Hayward's shot, just knocking off the front of that rim. But I can't forget how silent that entire place fell. And while it is one of my favorite memories just because of how iconic that was, it was really sad. But I mean, getting to go to a championship game, it has to be one of my favorite memories.
Oh yeah, and win or lose, I think that emotion is a part of what makes sports just so beautiful, and that's a memory that is always going to be ingrained in your mind. Your first championship experience, like that's absolutely incredible just to be a part of. And Will, I want to offer the same prompt to you. Just an iconic college basketball memory. I know you're from Chicago, so I don't know if it has to do with more of a Chicago-style team, but what do you have?
Well, I actually have a couple. So the first one I'll mention was actually Loyola Chicago when they made their run a couple years ago.
Oh, yes.
I was waiting for that.
Didn't really have a stake in the team, but it was just so fun to watch them,
Exactly.
go through the tournament. I mean, they destroyed my bracket. I'm sure they destroyed a lot of people's. But I was like, it was one of those times I was like, I don't really care. Like, this is great to watch. Like, it's just so cool to see them hitting all those buzzer beaters, and just when teams have fun like that, it's just a beautiful thing to watch. And it got them all the way to the Final Four. So that's one. The other, I grew up a Wisconsin fan, actually. My dad went to UW-Madison. So, they'd always had a pretty good team But 2014, 2015 was when they had Frank Kaminsky and Sam Decker and Bronson Koenig and all those guys. It was a really talented team. They went to back-to-back Final Fours and, of course, played in the national championship in 2015. And that was my favorite memory, was when they beat Kentucky. Kentucky was 38-0 in 2015 in the Final Four, and Wisconsin beat them in that game to break the unbeaten season. Of course, then Wisconsin lost to Duke, I believe it was, in the national championship game. That was with Grayson Allen and Julia Okafor. But that was just, it was really cool getting to watch that with my dad, because, for him, I mean, that was incredible. Wisconsin hadn't made a Final Four since the 1940s, I think. So it was cool to be there with him, but also cool to watch it as a fan, of a team doing so well.
Yeah, exactly. And I like that both of your memories are sort of, tied to your family experience, watching these games with your families. And keeping it sort of local and within the community, I want to talk about IU basketball, because IU obviously has a storied history, but at the same time, we're all in our early 20s, so we didn't really experience that long time, the 1970s, the era of dominance. But there's still plenty of IU basketball that can create memories. So, Grace, I want to start with you. What is the ultimate IU basketball memory that you have locked in your memory bank?
So mine is a little bit more recent because, like we were talking about family, my dad went to Purdue, so I grew up a Purdue fan. I know it's kind of embarrassing.
Ouch.
So all my memories are associated with Purdue. Up until I came here. In my freshman year, which was 2018, I went to the Crossroads Classic, and that was when Rob Finney hit that buzzer beater, and just Banker's life went nuts. And I think that was such a cool experience because I had, watched all of, March Madness and watched college basketball for so long on TV, but finally getting to be a student and experience it for myself was just such a different experience. So that has to be one of my favorite memories.
Yeah, just being in that moment. Will, what IU memory do you have locked away?
Oh, man. I've been trying to think about this one for a while now. I didn't grow up an IU fan, so it's kind of a limited pool. I think the one that always stands out to me, it was my freshman year, and it was a losing effort for IU. It was when IU played Duke.
Yeah.
But I was at the game, and I just remember the first half IU was up, and they were playing well, and there was a sequence. It was, I forget who was running the break, but it might have been Robert Johnson and Freddie McSwain. And Robert Johnson tossed an alley-oop to Freddie McSwain, and he dunked it right on, I think it was Marvin Bagley. It was either Marvin Bagley or Wendell Carter for Duke. And Assembly Hall just went berserk. I mean, and of course, like I said, IU ended up losing the game because that was the first 2 years of the Archie Miller era. Was a lot of heartbreaking losses.
Exactly.
But it was just that was kind of like my first indoctrination into IU basketball, and I was just like, this is incredible. This is speaking as a fan, it was so cool to get to witness that. I kind of understood what the hype was about.
Yeah, and I'm coming from a similar situation where I didn't grow up within the IU community. I find it interesting. None of us really did, but we've all become such a part of this program. And I know one thing that I said from day one my freshman year was I just want to be a part of a field rush, a court storm, say what you will about the whole idea of it, but I wanted to be a part of that community because I never had that experience. So when IU beat Michigan State, Barstool Storm Chasers were there for the game. And once I saw them pre-game, that thought immediately went in my head. I'm like, this could be it. And every little moment that kept leading up to this could be the day, this could be the day, this could be the day. And then finally, Cassius Winston misses the game-winning shot. The fans stormed the court. I think my friend had just recently torn his ACL, so we were trying to get him down the stairs as well, but not leave him behind. It was a whole process. He made it down eventually. But I also did go ahead because I wanted to be a part of it,
So you left him behind?
Maybe, but I wanted to be a part of it, I wanted to be a part of this moment, and he made it there eventually, and it was all good. I didn't do any significant damage, but it was a fun process overall, and it's just to be a part of that atmosphere is always just the part of college basketball that I love the most. And so that's gonna lead me to my very last question. Will, I want to start with you. Just looking forward, college basketball is finally returning. It's right around the corner. Just what are you most looking forward to after these past several months of, chaos, if you can say? What are you most looking forward to in just seeing college basketball return to the court in whatever capacity it may be?
Well, I've got a couple of things. One for IU women's basketball. I'm really excited to see how Allie Patberg plays. I mean, she's been hyped up, like I said, on a lot of award watch lists and whatnot. But I mean, I think more than anything, Terry Moore has really talked about how she's implored Patberg to just step up her game and really take over games. I think if that happens, I mean, she is a serious contender for those awards, probably a serious contender for Big Ten Player of the Year. Because she's got the skill. She's slated to go somewhere in the second round of the WNBA draft in some early mocks. So she's got the talent. I would be excited to see how that plays out, because when she ups her game too, it'll up the rest of the team. And the other thing, it's honestly just getting to see March Madness again. I missed it last year. It's such a, it becomes such a part of your routine every year, right? Filling out those brackets, watching the games in the middle of class. It's cool. And
I think you mean doing work in the middle of class,
right?
And just happening to catch the score as it
multitasking.
Yeah, exactly. There we go.
Having multiple windows open, maybe at the same
exactly.
time.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm trying to see how far my laptop battery can go, but that's what I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, that obviously just Allie Patberg, a lot of hype, and it'll be a lot of fun to see how she plays into that, and of course just March Madness as a whole. And Grace, what is the thing that you're looking forward to just cap off this crazy summer we're now getting into IU basketball overall?
Well, I think kind of along with what Will said is we didn't get this last March Madness, and we kind of took it for granted a bit, just something that we had every single March. And when we had to spend that entire March inside of our houses without basketball, it was so hard. And I know it was probably so hard on the players, so hard on the coaches, if it was that hard for us as fans. So now just kind of excited to have college basketball back on TV and looking forward to this new March Madness. And now we get to see these players that have worked so hard in this off season, and I know that they're going to come out and play even harder because they didn't get this March Madness this past year. So just to see how excited everyone is to be back, even if the circumstances aren't the same, I think that's what I'm most excited about, is because it's going to be such good basketball.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it perfectly. It's one of those situations where you don't really know what you have until
It's
you
gone.
don't have until it's gone, and that's what we've seen with March Madness this past year. And ideally, we'll get to see all of that play out. And yeah, as you mentioned, I mean, just the players laying their absolute hearts out on the floor, and it'll be a lot sweeter now knowing, what it would be like otherwise. So yeah, the great moments all the way around, and a perfect way to wrap up this show. So that is going to do it for our show this week. But be sure to continue our discussion on our Twitter page at IUSTV Sports and on Instagram at IUSTV Sports. You can always give any suggestions for the show and ask any questions you might have. And one last thing before we go. This will be my final episode hosting the Toss-Up here in Beckley Studio. So I just wanted to thank everyone who has ever contributed to the show in any way, both on and off the air. And perhaps most importantly, thanks to all of those in the control room who have shown up every week and make all of this possible. I've loved every bit of working with IUSTV for the past few years and appreciate all of the guidance and support that this program has given me. So with that being said, for all of us here at IUSTV, toss it up and find out if we'll catch it. We'll see you next time.